Hey friend, welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It. Now, let me be honest with you, okay? There's episodes that we record, and every episode I feel like brings some value to the party and to the table, without question. And then there's other episodes that we record them, and I can't get them out fast enough. Truth be told, this episode wasn't probably going to be released for another couple of months, but after taping with Kharma Lindsey and Dr. David Leicken, I decided to push this all the way up to today. I wanted this podcast out as soon as possible because of the things that we tackle in this episode: PTSD, grief, finding a purpose that's bigger than yourself, integration therapy, psychedelics, all of it. There's so many incredible nuggets in this podcast. And if you're like me and you love a good nugget, today's going to freaking blow your mind. Let's just get to it. It's so good today. Thank you for being a part of Learn from People Who Lived It. At the end of this podcast, after you are completely inspired to, make sure you forward it on to that one person who you think in your mind needs to hear it. Okay? Thanks for being here. Let's go.
Looking for no bullshit conversation about mental health? Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
Well, we want to welcome everyone to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It. We're going to get into it today with Kharma Lindsey in just a couple of moments, but Dr. David Leicken and myself both here for another episode. Morning, sir.
Hey, how's it going?
I am doing well. I have a question for you. And for the folks who've been listening to our podcast a lot, you know Dr. Dave, you know me, you kind of know his stance on just about everything that we've talked about from time to time. And, we're getting ready to sit down with, like I said, Kharma Lindsey today. And one of the things we're going to talk about is PTSD. We're going to talk about grief. We're going to talk about, kind of going through the system and doing anything for your kid and the kind of crap that can pile on with that whole episode. Right. But as we were getting ready to tape today, Dave, one of the things that she's going to talk a lot about is psychedelic therapy. She's used some psychedelic medicines to help her in her own journey, and now she, leads some circles and uses ketamine and some other psychedelics to help people with PTSD. As a guy who spent 2 decades helping veterans with PTSD, and I'm just curious where you are currently with some of the psychedelic therapy, and do you ever find yourself, and the answer might be no, but do you ever find yourself going, man, I wish I would have had some of these tools along the way? Has your opinion shifted at all regarding this stuff?
Yeah, I would say I'm very optimistic, but I'm still kind of waiting for the data to come in a bit more with it. Certainly folks that set up businesses, are going to be actively promoting what they're doing. But as the science has actually been coming in, some things are looking very positive, and then there's always been some surprises. Like I was surprised to find out that mushrooms can sometimes cause damage to heart valves. So I think, with skepticism about traditional medicine and honestly, traditional medications for depression and for anxiety, they work to some extent. They don't work for everybody. They don't work 100% in a lot of cases. There's certainly room on the table for additional options and considering different approaches to things. And it's certainly way more complex than, hey, just take a treatment and everything's going to be fine. There's definitely a psychological component to it and a relearning component to it. But I think what is very encouraging about psychedelics is the idea of opening up neuroplasticity, which is something that medications, typical pharmaceutical medications don't do as aggressively or don't do as vigorously. Putting the mind into a learning state so that you could undo some of those, stubborn patterns that have held on for so long.
Could be beneficial. Well, isn't that the message that we've kind of been saying for the last couple of years, which is not every treatment is right for everybody. And there's a lot of people that, man, they should stay down the traditional road. There's some people who should really give this kind of a thing we're getting ready to talk about today a shot. It's not a one size fits all operation anymore. And if there's anything that we can help people do, it's to understand that point.
Oh, sure. And anecdotally, I've seen some people really do amazingly well on alternative treatments. I can think of a guy that did a traditional sweat lodge treatment with my brain isn't working today.
Was it like a psychedelic, like a San Pedro or ayahuasca,
Yeah,
or
it was psilocybin.
there you go.
Yeah, and he had bad PTSD for years and years, and from one visit to the next, he was dramatically transformed. I mean, you couldn't recognize him from the person that he was before. He came into the office smiling, where usually, he would be stiff and anxious and looking around and a little suspicious. It was just gone after this vision quest that he went on. So I've seen some pretty dramatic transformations with people. And I remember really early on, there was another gentleman that I had been seeing with PTSD, and he started getting ketamine, which at the time, this was like about 10 years ago, it was just the infusions. Now they have nasal spray and other things that they're using. But he reported feeling dramatically better, and you could see the way he's carrying himself. He seemed lighter. He seemed just genuinely more relaxed, which is not typically how people come into the office. So there's definitely a lot of promise there, but I think it makes sense to kind of take the time to understand, what it is, what the side effects are, and have a fuller picture of what we're doing. So I always kind of take a little bit of a skeptical approach and a wait and see attitude, but it definitely is very promising.
All right, this is the beauty of having you on this podcast, man, is you balance us out a little bit, and I really do appreciate that. So today we're going to sit down with Kharma Lindsey, and we're going to have this discussion a little bit. And, she's somebody who's no stranger to PTSD, mostly because of a situation that she dealt with the custody battle of her kiddo. And to say that it was a shit show is probably putting it mildly. It was a mess, Dave. I mean, she wrote to us that basically she was dealing with a narcissist who waged war on her, and it wasn't just her that she was up against, but it was the legal system. And the legal system ended up just taking a huge dump on this project, so much so that the judge that was involved is no longer allowed to practice law anymore. And so there were a lot of hurdles to jump through for her to just have that one thing that we all want as parents, which is to come home and have our kids there. So we're going to welcome her to our podcast this morning from beautiful Sedona, Arizona. Good morning, Kharma Lindsey.
Good morning. Hi, Matthew. Hello.
How you doing?
Dr. Dave, good to meet you.
Yes.
Good to meet you as well.
So give us your opening sort of thoughts on what Dave was putting out there about, what his viewpoints about the psychedelic medicines, and then maybe you could talk a little bit about what you've seen. But as you were listening to us there, what was standing out for you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. What stood out for me was just a really resounding yes. Like, yes, we can't look at psychedelics like a one size fits all, just like we can't look at traditional Western medicine the same. I've seen a lot of people have incredible healing from psychedelic medicines, and I've also seen people go backwards. I've seen people be harmed by psychedelic medicines. And so I take also a conservative approach and a case-by-case approach with this. We've seen some pretty amazing transformations within the last couple of years as both an independent contractor with an at-home ketamine company, as well as, within the psilocybin world in my own private practice. And at the same time, it's like I've also seen cases outside that are really, they give me pause. And I don't think that it's one of those things where we should just, we are in a psychedelic renaissance, but we shouldn't necessarily treat it like the Wild West either. So I definitely appreciate Dr. Dave's approach to this, and I think that better to be safe than sorry. Better to have more information, make those informed choices, really sit with our clients and let them know all of the risks that we currently know about. Let them know that there are potential risks we don't know about. But I will say that most people that find their way to me are people who are kind of at the end of their rope, and they will be very boldly stating that if this doesn't work, they don't know what else will, because they've tried everything else.
I can totally relate to that. And I've come to discover over the last few years that everybody gets to a breaking point, and eventually people who are struggling with any kind of mental health, they get to a point where they go, this doesn't work for me any longer, and I have to try something, and I'm willing to try anything. And then they go down that road of, discovering what's going to work for them. And we've talked about it a number of times on this podcast, because we've done, I don't know, this maybe a dozen episodes now on psychedelics. And, the one thing that I'm always really careful to say is they're not for everybody. We've talked about it a lot. Dave said it a lot. Like, if you're bipolar, if you're schizophrenic, like, you should never touch this medicine, because it can really, really hurt you. And then, Dave and I ran into each other at the Waste Management Phoenix Golf Open just a couple of weeks ago. And you mentioned something to me, Dave, that I found really, really interesting that I'd never heard before, which is, a lot of people should never touch this medicine before they turn 25 because of the way that the brain develops. Could you kind of let people in on our conversation there?
Yeah, cannabis in particular, it can affect the wiring of your brain. So the general school of thought is, if you're going to use it at all, you should wait until you're in your 20s and not dabble as a teenager. I've seen plenty of cases over the years where teenagers got involved with using cannabis on a regular basis, and then kind of unlocked either bipolar or schizophrenia, where they had maybe a family history, or maybe the genetics were latent there, but it was the use of the cannabis that kind of unlocked it for them, and led to then a lifelong history of then dealing with a major mental illness on top of whatever else they were dealing with before.
Okay.
So yeah, it's best to not screw around with your brain while it's still wiring itself.
Okay. So then I'm going to pivot back to you, Kharma. And, you mentioned that you have helped people and they haven't had a great experience. So what does that look like? I think maybe a lot of us think about it in terms of like a bad trip. Is that how you would phrase it? Or what? Give me an example of something that you've seen, because obviously we're here to talk about the benefits. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the good things that happen. But we should do our due diligence, and we should talk about what could happen for somebody too. So what maybe have you seen? One example that stands out.
Yeah, one example that stands out was not a client that I had vetted or I had worked with, but it was a client I was brought in to consult with, because they were kind of not really knowing what to do. We had a client, a coworker of mine, saw a client. They sat with them with a medicine session. I can go into the many ways that we could have possibly prevented this, and I won't necessarily go into that, because there are many, many ways that it could have been prevented. But bottom line is that this particular practitioner, on a, basically acting as a spiritual coach only, sat with a client that was utilizing psilocybin, and health history probably could have prevented it. But this client was also on medications that would be strongly contraindicated with psilocybin use. And that client ended up in serotonin syndrome. And that was something that could be very dangerous, very deadly.
Yeah.
And to compound it, the client was also on an anti-seizure medicine. So the traditional, like the big biomarkers we would look at and say, oh, this is serotonin syndrome, point the finger at it, just weren't there. And so, to be able to really see that and decode that, I don't know, it was kind of scary to be able to look at that and go, wow, this could have ended so much worse than it did.
Yeah.
And then honestly, after the client, recovered physically from that, everything was good. But I've also seen clients who've dropped into some really challenging journeys. I had one client who's a veteran, had served in Iraq, lost troops under his command. And in his journey, probably the only time in my career that I ever went, oh shit, I'm maybe in over my head, because this guy was a lot bigger than me in special ops, when he was in the military, and really dropped into that flashback. And we were able to, just talk it through, walk it through, use Ho'oponopono, use those images of each of those men, conjure up their photos in his mind, and really ask for forgiveness. And he experienced a deep level of healing that just completely changed things for him. So even during the journey, it can be very, very challenging, but I think that's the benefit of having someone who has been there and done that many, many times on their own as well, to guide you, so that as you're experiencing these challenging things, that you can actually create that healing, in those moments and afterwards.
Okay, so Dave, if I were just listening to this podcast, I would go to Google and I would type in, what is serotonin syndrome? But I'm not going to do that, because I have a psychiatrist on the show. So help us understand what she just talked about.
Yeah, it doesn't happen all that often, but it's one of those things where when I've seen it in the clinical setting, it's kind of a stacking up effect. So maybe you're on an antidepressant that's boosting serotonin, and then you're on a pain medication like tramadol, which also boosts serotonin. And then you have one other thing that goes in. So as you keep adding these different layers to it, you can get to a point where um, it can spiral out of control, and the symptoms are you start sweating, getting very shaky, develop a very high fever, nausea, vomiting, confusion, and it does become a life-threatening emergency if it's not dealt with fairly quickly. So yeah,
Scary stuff.
yeah. I mean, in some cases, if you're looking for that stacking effect, you might be able to at least anticipate it. But if you don't see the other piece of it, this is where sometimes psychiatrists can get in trouble with primary care doctors. If you don't have a good history of what somebody's taking from all their subspecialists and their primary care, and then you add something else to it, not knowing what else is there, it can not play well with the other medications.
Got it. Okay, so one of the things that we talk a lot about on this podcast, Kharma, is something that I call the transitional character. It was an idea that was planted to me a few years ago, and it was really this idea around I'm the person here in my lineage that's here to end dysfunction for me, for my family, for the people around me, because we've said it already, so I'm gonna say it again. Because my life was kind of a shit show growing up. It was a really challenging home life. And, like I always tell everybody, plenty of good stuff, plenty of I love yous, plenty of hugs, but nobody's in fucking therapy because they got too many hugs. So, we all go through some really challenging, some worse than others. And in that, kind of sets up this programming within all of us. And Dave and I, we've spent hours talking about patterns and beliefs and all of these things. You too experienced something really, really challenging going through the situation with the custody battle of a narcissistic ex and a court system that seemingly didn't have your back. And there's no doubt that left a mark on you. And there's no doubt that influenced the way that you acted, behaved, thought, lived your life. And now you're on the other side and you're helping people through their journey. So can you help us understand that sequence that shifted you from the person who all of this stuff was happening to the person who's now helping people as they're going through that journey? What was that moment for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to back up, there was definitely a pattern, right? Like our childhood wounds definitely come back in our adult relationships. And for me, that was exactly what happened. I was raised by a narcissist. My grandmother was my primary caregiver, definitely very narcissistic. I remember one of my earliest childhood memories is just kind of watching incredulously as she talked about one person and then went to another group and talked about another person in church, and ultimately ended up getting kicked out of the church because she was such a shit stirrer. And it was so normalized in my world as a child that when I met my ex-husband, it was just normal. This was just normal behavior. I wouldn't say that I participated in it, but when I saw it, it didn't raise the red flags that I think most of us would see. And so that should have been my first clue. I was married for 8 years to my ex-husband. We actually had a blended family. I had children prior to the marriage, and so did he. And we had one child together. And we ended up, in a divorce. The divorce went okay, but a few years later, it was really interesting. I think he realized that, when COVID had happened, my business was closed. COVID, it's the first challenge in my world was COVID. I was already on this path of self-exploration, but the business that I owned was closed. And I think he realized this is a good opportunity to, out money, honestly. Knew I couldn't afford an attorney, knew I was, barely hanging on to the house, and really went after me, guns blazing, for our daughter. And there were a lot of accusations thrown around. We live in a very small town. Everybody knows everyone. I always say it's like half a degree of separation. And I'd always had this very good reputation in town. very good reputation, had a wellness center, beauty salon, all kinds of things that really served the community in a very visible way. And the allegations he threw against me were just, I mean, it was character assassination. And in this small town, like, everyone just kind of held their breath, and they were like, oh my gosh, like, nobody believed it, nobody who knew me anyway. But as it kind of ground its way through the courts, um, it became very clear that our judge wasn't listening. I mean, allegations from drug abuse, drug use. I never even got the opportunity to take one drug test to prove it wrong. It just was almost like this judge, as soon as she heard, his side of the testimony, was determined to not listen to anything that I said or my witnesses said. And it was very very difficult. I had this Pollyanna view, though, like I think most of us do, that, well, if I go to court and I just tell the truth and I bring people in who tell the truth, that the judge is just going to see the truth and it's all going to work out. And man, that Pollyanna view came back and just bit me, because that's not how it worked out. And so basically, I was sitting here with my 11-year-old in the hands of my ex-husband, who had been abusive to us when I was married. We had shared custody of her during our divorce, but as she got older and more opinionated, I had more and more concerns. And it ultimately, those concerns, they really just went unheard. And ultimately, what ended up happening is I didn't lose custody of her, but I ended up with less custody than, people who have felonies or drug convictions. And I fought it. And I think it was more my reaction to what happened than it was anything, because I just really, like, there was this piece of injustice, this injustice trauma that apparently I didn't even know existed inside of me, coupled with the fact that, like, I just couldn't believe any of this was happening. And when a superior court judge says, oh yeah, these things are true, everyone in town, in a small town like that, starts looking at you sideways. And even though they don't really believe it, they also don't really not believe it, because, like, a person in a black robe said it was true. And man, that was so hard. And I found that there were other families in town, though. Anyone who was, not to be politically incorrect, but not waspy, ended up in front of this judge, most of the time ended up losing their children. And there were over 300 families by the end of 1 year that had come forward, because I was really vocal about what was going on. It was like, no, I was not going down without kicking and screaming. And over 300 people came forward and said, this has happened to me too. And we started comparing the paperwork. We had a paralegal in town who was willing to take on the cause. And it was almost like it read like a playbook. Everything that was filed at the initial pleading, it all read the same way. They were using the same attorneys, two attorneys in town. And they all ended up in front of this judge, and the outcome was the same. And we started to really clue in that this was bigger than just my case. This was bigger than just a few cases. And although it took the judge getting a DUI, an extreme DUI, and having that be very, very political and very public for people to take what we were saying seriously, they ultimately did. And we filed a joint petition with the Judicial Ethics Committee, and they have subsequently, put down sanctions, including, she's not allowed to practice law. She doesn't have her, her retirement. She basically is, was given the greatest sanctions they could, with, just short of putting her in jail.
So then talk to us about how you overcome this, because, I think Dave and I could agree on this. Like, that's a lot, man. That's a lot of ammunition coming your way. That's a freaking firestorm coming your way. And man, just waking up in the morning knowing that this is all happening is so heavy. So how are you able to then, okay, so the thing happens, right? Because we've all had this thing happen to us. How do we overcome it? How did you set that down and continue to move on?
Well, great question. To be honest, I looked at a cause that was bigger than mine. Like, I honestly think that if I hadn't been approached by these other families, if I hadn't realized I wasn't alone in it, I was on a pretty self-destructive path. I sold everything I owned to take this and fight this all the way through the appeals court. It basically imploded my world, which was probably not the most, intelligent thing to do looking back on it. But that was my reaction, was, no, I'm fighting this to the death. And then when I realized there were more families than just mine, that's when it became actionable in a different way. It was, no, we're not going to let this drop. We're going to take this. We're going to not shut up. We're going to band together. We're not alone. And so the medicine of community was really huge for me. Also realizing that, this wasn't just about our children. This was about, like justice. So we kind of became crusaders in that. But then, as the dust settled through all of that, I ended up, with the option of having more time with my child. At this point, though, it was about 2.5 years later. And, fast forward, she's going into being a teenager. She's already been estranged from me. And there really was no reclaiming that relationship as it was. And I had to face that and grieve that in a big way. And we have a good relationship now. Just the other day, she drove me around the mall in her own car, and we have wonderful times together. But it is very changed, and it's going to, it's something that just can't be undone. And to grieve that and to create a way forward. But for me, I think that the biggest thing was, being able to utilize the medicines that we're here to also talk about, to really shift my looping thoughts, those looping patterns of thought, that hopelessness, that, just kind of, I had to kind of pull myself from the place of, I will burn it to the ground if I have to, and to light the fire so people can see what's going on. I mean, as much as I have respect for Erin Brockovich, man, walking that journey myself, even in this small way, has just really been so difficult. And to then say, okay, what's next? Because for a long time, I couldn't see anything beyond that fight. I couldn't see anything beyond, that pain. And to also look at what's next, I think that was probably the most disorienting for me.
I have a couple of questions, but I want to ask Dave really quick. You spend a lot of time. We always talk about patterns on this podcast. But the question that I want to ask you, Dave, to dig into a little bit is what she just mentioned. So you can't get time back. And like in her example, when the daughter does come back into her life, it's a different relationship. And so I want you to speak a little bit to how people can kind of, I don't know, maybe it's cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe it's psychedelics but how can we get through and I'm sorry I'm taking such a hard time or a long road to this question, but it's difficult to accept that it's different forever.
Right.
But it is. And so talk to me about accepting that it's different forever and still moving on.
Well, there's one step prior to that. So when you've spent a couple of years either fighting something or running from something, or you're in kind of a prolonged, agitated kind of fight or flight state, transitioning out of that can be difficult, right? So just imagine a situation where you were walking on an empty street at night, and you walk past an alleyway and somebody jumps out to attack you, and you start running, right? How many blocks do you need to run before you can feel that it's safe to stop running, right? So you're in a fight mode for a period of time, and maybe it's a prolonged legal battle, and there's stretches where there's really nothing going on, and then there's stretches where it becomes really intense. At what point do you say, okay, now I'm at a good point, I can move forward? And that can have a couple branches to it too. One is, I didn't get the result that I want. I need to let go and move forward anyway. Or I did get the result that I want, and now I need to rebuild. And how do I begin doing that? So finding that point can be a difficult first step in it. And I think it is, truly a grieving process. You have to be very deliberate about it, and come to a point of saying, okay, I can stop running now, because you do it on autopilot after a while. And especially when you've been doing it for years, it becomes kind of second nature to just react to things in a certain way. Or, somebody challenges you with something, and instead of being measured in your response, kind of jump out at them and get into fight mode right away. You can't live the entirety of your life doing that. You have to eventually restore some balance to it. But I think the first place to start is coming to a point of deliberately looking at things and saying, okay, it's time to start rebuilding. It's time to start moving on. And then you can think through the process of, what do I need to do? and that can involve different things. Maybe it's going for therapy, maybe it's getting on medication, maybe it's changing things with diet and exercise, right? There's things that you can do to start restoring wholeness again. But it first starts with that realization that, okay, it's time to make a shift.
So one of the things that is kind of coming through me right now is a meditation that I did while I was sorting out all my stuff from my past, and I want to take everybody on this meditation really briefly, if you guys don't mind. Which is, I want you to sit there, and if you can, and you can close your eyes and you can have a moment with us, great. But I want you to think about, like, okay, you're walking into a room right now, and there's two suitcases. And in one suitcase is all the terrible things that have happened to you in your life. And then in the other suitcase, it's all the possibilities and the things that you sort of daydream about what your life could look like. And you're going to walk into this room, and you're going to pick up both of those suitcases, and you're going to hold on to them for just a second. And what you're going to discover is that one of them feels a little bit heavier than the other. And that's probably the one that's full of all the terrible things that happened to you along the way. And so you stand there with those two thoughts, and you think about, which one feels like the one that I should leave the room with? And as you sit there and you contemplate this, you're going to need to go through a little bit of a grieving period, because setting down those things that aren't serving you anymore means that you're going to leave the room a different person. You're not going to be the same person that you were when you walked into the room to grab the bag. And so if you can, in this moment, and this is going to take practice, but how do you just set down that suitcase that's filled with all the things that aren't serving you anymore? And how do you move into a space where you get to renegotiate your life and reset your life and pour into yourself a little bit more? That's the space that I really want to encourage people to jump into. And I think it's a great segue to talk about the psychedelic medicine, because one of the things that is true about psychedelics is if you don't set an intention for what you're hoping to experience with this medicine, you're kind of leaving it up to God, so to speak, right? But and you, I don't know, that doesn't feel like a smart way to handle the medicine. And I think anybody, and you could probably agree with us, Kharma, having an intention when you're going to go in to dabble in this medicine is going to allow you to, as you said earlier, open up your mind a little bit, see things that you couldn't. And then, as Dr. Dave said, when you're in that spongy state, you can kind of recreate some neural pathways and live life the way that you want to. And so now that you're living your life with this new suitcase filled with potential and the way that you want to do things, help us understand a little bit, Kharma, the number one, the power of setting that intention. And then if you can, walk us through your own personal journey of having to set down the suitcase that you were carrying that wasn't serving you anymore and was literally weighing you down.
Yeah, I so appreciate the way that you just asked that question, Matthew. And I look at the intention like, well, let's just back up. We have shadow programs, right? Those programs that are running like background apps in our head. And we call it being in shadow, which just means we just are unconscious of them. It's like the incoming information comes in, our brain says, oh, the incoming information came in, and this is what I do with it. And it's an automatic default setting. And so what I think is so important to note is that when we set our intention, what we're actually doing is saying, I'd like for the lid on that shadow box, that place that we put that, where that program lives that says this comes in and I do this. We need to access that box. It's in our brain. We need to access that pathway because it's been programmed in the default setting. That means that we don't even think about it. It comes in, we just automatically do it.
Right.
Autopilot, exactly. And so when we set our intention, we actually drop into that space. The medicine's just the key that unlocks that box, that gives us access to that program. And I call them like, they're kind of firewalled. It's like when we put it on autopilot, we put it in the shadows, it's autopiloted. It's literally firewalled though, because our conscious mind doesn't access it because it doesn't even realize it's there. It's in the shadows, it's a blind spot. So when we set the intention around what is this feeling that is my speed bump? What's the feeling that rises up in my body? What's the thought that comes into my head right before I get derailed or right before I have to push through or I have to, I get triggered and that trigger just runs its course, right? Because our triggers, they live in that shadow space. So when we set the intention to either create awareness or just simply release the emotion and feel safe with it, oftentimes it's the emotion that rises up. We feel it in our body. It flips the switch and we run the program. To be able to create awareness around that, the intention is really us saying, this is the box we want open today in this session with this medicine. It's just the key. It doesn't do the work that we do. We do the work with what comes out. So when it comes to the programs that I was running, man, they were deep. And I realize now, like looking back, hindsight is so 2020. I look back and I go, man, these are just programs that were running when I was a kid. These are survival strategies from when I was a kid. And I realized like this injustice trigger was pervasive all the way through childhood, all the way through. And it's like, no wonder it ran so deep. No wonder it was so visceral in my body. And also, just recognizing that, is it serving me or not? Like, does this still serve me? Maybe it served me as a kid. Maybe it served me as an adult. Certainly not serving me right now. I'm burning my world down with it. And how can I now access this? And I knew I was in trouble. I remember one specific day, there was just this nonstop barrage of stuff with this hearing. And we were preparing for court. The hearing was about a week off. And as you guys know, that's usually the deadline for all the discovery. And the attorneys are calling right and left. And that evening I sat there and I was so, like, my nervous system was shot. My heart rate wouldn't get below 100 and I'm just sitting there. And I'm just like, I don't know what to do. And I crawled into bed, pulled the covers over my head. I stayed there for 3 days. I got up, barely ate, just slept, didn't shower. I had a friend come over and bless his heart, he came in, sat down next to me and was like, you got to go to Sweat Lodge. Like, you got to go. And I just went, I don't have it in me to tend fire, because that's what my role was. Is I served the community. I wasn't the person receiving. I was the person serving. And he just said to me, no, you need to go. Like, what better way to shed this than to sweat it out, face down on Mama Gaia, just be there. And I sat with psilocybin in that lodge. Not a lot, just a little, but just enough. And man, the emotions that poured forward, the sadness, the rage, the shame, the pain, all of it just like pouring forward. And I just remember crying in this lodge, and my community was around me. My tribe was around me. They were holding space for me. Nobody was touching me. Nobody was saying anything. Nobody was trying to make it better. They just sat there rock solid. And I cried and I beat my fists into the earth. And it was like the snot and all of it, right? And I laid there, finally completely exhausted, face down in the dirt, mud by this point, and I felt everything reset. And I walked out of lodge, and that cold air hit my skin. We sat by the fire, we ate food, and it was like this whole system reset. And just like, okay, I'm here, I'm safe. I can do this. I can do the hard things. And I moved forward from there. And for me, like, I don't think it was any one thing. It wasn't just the psychedelics. It wasn't just the Sweat Lodge. It was everything. It was all of it. It was the community. It was the sacred traditions that I had been sitting with. And so all of it was really, I credit all of it to that moment of turnaround.
Can I ask Dr. Dave a question? Don't you think, buddy, like, this is the one thing that most people won't allow themselves the opportunity to do, is to just go through the ugly part of it, right?
That was the thing that jumped out at me as we were listening here, is when usually it's anxiety that shuts people down, right? So you look at something, it seems too big, it seems too overwhelming, and then you back away from it instead of moving forward with it. And going through that and experiencing the rage and the sorrow and just embracing the entire thing, turning your face into the storm and just letting the wind hit you, right? You go through that, and on the other side of it, you have this realization. It's like, oh, I'm still here. It didn't kill me. I can still move forward. So facing things is not going to be a death sentence. You can get through it on the other side. And then on the other side, now there's all these options that weren't available before, because you were shutting yourself down pretty much, not necessarily intentionally, but just those processes, the anxiety and and fear and intimidation shuts you down. And
It's that balance though, right? Because as a parent, you're sort of like in this mindset where you're like, I got to be strong for everybody. I got to hold it together for everybody.
yeah,
But
but
the
if you
only
don't
thing that you
have a
really
well
need is
to
to
draw
let it go, right?
right, if you don't have a well to draw from, what are you giving to other people
That's
around
it.
you?
That's it.
You know, if you don't work on yourself and get filled back up again, you have no resource to draw upon.
Yeah, and what's interesting, and what I really hope people are kind of taking away from this conversation is, you do some sound healings now, don't you? Kind of sound and drums, Kharma, in your life.
Yeah. Back to that indigenous tradition of drums. That's deep in my practice, as well as sound healing, breath work. So there's a lot of ways to reach non-ordinary consciousness, not just medicines.
That's
We
it.
can do it with the hypnagogic state with the drums. We can do that with our breath work. There's many different ways, just blissing out to the sound bath. Sound bath is going to bring us with right-left brain hemisphere activation, much like like using EMDR or using binaural beats. With the right left of our brain with the drums, drumming on drums, we're doing the same thing. So we're really bringing ourselves back into a state of neuroregulation using, these really, ancient medicines.
I will tell people that when I was going through my retreat, I had one particular day that was very, very challenging. I drummed up this memory from 9 years old that was super unpleasant. So I had this like counseling session where I was talking to this person about it. And then I did a land journey where I went out into nature right after that and just sort of didn't say much, just kind of quietly cried as I was walking in nature and just had these sort of tears coming from my eyes. And then I stepped into a sound bath. And I did this sound healing with this woman. And Dr. Dave, I don't know if you've ever experienced one of these, but they've got these bowls and they're creating this frequency around it. And I laid on the ground, and I'll share my experience with everyone because I think it's helpful. So I laid on the ground, and the first thought that I had was, "This is fucking ridiculous. This is fucking stupid. I don't want to have any part of this whole thing. It's just the stupidest shit. I'm a grown damn man, and I'm laying on the ground, and this woman is putting this thing around this bowl, and I got super agitated, and then I had to pee, and I was like, fuck it, I'm just gonna get up. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And then in like a moment, I can't even explain it. In a moment, it was like somebody plugged electric sockets into the bottom of my feet. All of a sudden, my body started to vibrate and get on this weird level, and I just started to cry. And then I just started to sob. And this goes on for maybe 10 or 12 minutes. And I'm like ugly crying as a grown man. We get through the whole experience. We have this nice little prayer at the end. And I'm not kidding you. I think I experienced what you just described, Kharma. It was a night and day experience for me. I always tell people, like, I felt 200 pounds lighter, and I don't weigh 200 pounds. It was like a different person walked out the door. I don't know what it was about that sound frequency. Maybe you can help us understand this, but it shed everything. And in a moment, almost everything was different. All of a sudden, I had this capacity to think about new thoughts, and I had this capacity to see things a different way. And I had these beliefs that had been a part of me forever that didn't seem like they were useful anymore. I don't know what the hell happened, but it was really incredible.
Yeah, that sounds to me like returning back to a state of neuroregulation.
Okay.
Where our brain waves are all in harmony now, right? Like we're I call it DEFCON 0. We're safe, right? And our DEFCON level is where's our threat level? Where's our safety level? And when we're in a heightened emotional state, we're sitting there at this like DEFCON 3 or higher, right? Like, is there threat? Is there not threat? When we experience these difficult emotions, man, it brings up the threat response in our body. It's our survival strategies. And when we're in that state, we can go into all the neuroscience, and I'm sure Dr. Dave can do it better than I can, but we don't have, our brain waves are dysregulated. We have a dysregulated nervous system. And when we come back into a state of re-regulation, where we return to a baseline of safety, now we just are so expansive. We are able to open to all possibilities. We're able to shed those heavy emotions that were creating that dysregulation. And it works. It feels like magic, especially in those moments, but it's really, really positively healing. And I don't know if you guys have are fans of Bessel van der Kolk, but the body keeps the score. Some of that trauma is stored in our bodies. And when we experience vibration that moves through our body, it actually unlocks some of those stored traumas and just releases them for us to process. And it sounds like that was a beautiful story of healing right there.
Yeah, Dave, would you mind coming in, because what these thoughts come through me as people are talking on this podcast, and I think one of the beauties of this particular podcast, Learn from People Who Lived It, is that we have you, Dr. David. We have somebody who hasn't gone down this psychedelic alternative therapy his whole life, and it's been a little bit more in traditional medicine. And so, is you listen to us talk about these types of things, can you offer somebody who just isn't ready to hear about ketamine? They're just not ready to hear about psilocybin. They're never going to try these drugs for whatever reason. That's off the table for them. What other practical strategies might we offer somebody to get the ball rolling and get their life back to the way they want it to look like?
Sure. We just talked about sound bath, but also there's meditation and yoga and other mindfulness practices that are a fairly easy way to get started. You can kind of start where you're at and move forward with them. One of the most important things coming through like a sound bath experience and developing that deep relaxation, when you're in an agitated state, when you're in a fight or flight state, and when there's a level of tension that's there all the time, if it's anxiety or fear or whatever that program is that's running in the background, if your brain is oriented towards self-protection, you're not able to be creative. You're not able to love. Your brain is tied up. I mean, think of it, if you're defending your house from invading marauders, right? And you have to watch the windows all the time and make sure they're not trying to set your garage on fire or whatever. How are you going to be able to do anything else, anything creative, anything productive? Your entire time and your mind's energy is spent in a defensive posture, right? So getting to a point where you can relax and let go of some of those things, and be able to rest in that space, you're opening up space for creativity and to love and to consider other people and to kind of expand what you're capable of doing.
Okay, we're going to wrap up here in a couple of minutes. Dave, I'm going to stay with you for just a second because she mentioned something that was, I think, a pivotal moment for her. And you said, Kharma, when you were describing all of this court battle, you said, I picked a purpose that was bigger than myself. And so, Dave, I want you to just expand on that thought a little bit, because to me, that feels like something that somebody could choose who isn't ready for psychedelics or, any of the stuff that we're talking about. That feels like something real tangible for a person to grab onto, is what is bigger than yourself. So why is that important to find something bigger than you?
With all the latest research that's coming out about longevity and what it takes, what elements people need to incorporate into their life to live a long, healthy, and productive life, connection with other people is ranked up high with some of the other things. When you're isolated, when you're alone, it tends to shorten your life. People that are well integrated with other people and have some close friends and have some purpose in the community tend to live longer. So that's a good, compelling reason right there to try to get out of yourself and to try to think about other people. But also when you're helping other people, it could be a small thing like just doing something useful for a neighbor. You feel good. You feel connected. You feel like that you're useful and you have a purpose. And that then alters your brain chemistry. It helps to get rid of depression. It helps to get rid of anxiety. You're not just stuck in that negative state and looking at your own situation all the time.
Yeah, because we've had that neuroscientist on, and her big thing that I remember from her talking was the brain believes what you tell it. And part of the reason of like getting outside yourself and finding community and finding some purpose is that when you're serving other people, what are you not doing? You're not thinking about your own shit. And if you sit there and all you do is think about how fucked up your life is, guess what's going to happen? Your brain's just going to prove you right every single day. And every day you're going to wake up and you're going to go, see, this is what happens. See, I tried this and this is what went down. And when you're serving other people and not focusing on yourself, you really do have an opportunity to stop the thoughts a little bit, right? And then it's kind of cool what can happen as a result of that. And so The last
And the
word
other
is going to
piece
go
too,
to,
though,
yeah, go ahead.
when you're involved with other people, they have an opportunity to give to you as well, and they have a perspective that maybe you don't have, and that interacting helps to sharpen people and take them up to a level, get them kind of unstuck from where they are, because we don't have all the answers within ourselves. We're meant to be in relation with other people.
Well said. Kharma, you're going to get the last word on today's podcast. And so what might you offer to somebody who's stuck and in a routine and a pattern and a set of circumstances that they feel like they're never going to get out of? Because I'm sure you felt that way for a long time too. You had to have felt like, wow, this is going to be the rest of my life.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not the rest of your life. You're changed. You're on the other side of it. Now you're helping other people as they journey through this. And so what kind of hope might you offer?
Well, the first thought is finding a new normal, recognizing we're never going to go back to the way we were. We've experienced something that's changed us forever, and to focus on how do we find a new normal. And we've talked about a lot of strategies for non-ordinary consciousness, medicine being one of them. And, you can find practitioners or classes or workshops or things that are going to expand that sense of community. They're going to expand that sense of purpose. I find for me, what was super valuable was like, what is my purpose now? I wasn't done being a mom, but I kind of have to be, at least for a good chunk of my world. What am I going to do next? This was something I wasn't prepared to face. And so when we can look forward and say, what is my purpose? What do I want to contribute? What is this thing that I have inside of me that I want to bring forward into the world? And I think that, as we sat here, I was just reflecting as you were sharing on the community piece, like that is one of the integration strategies that's just vital and runs through the core of all of my teachings, whether we're doing sound bath, breath work, or, medicine work. Is we have to plug into our purpose and we have to plug into our community, because those two things are medicine in and of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like today's conversation was really important. And there were just so many moments while I was listening to both of you share your stories where I felt like the words were just coming through you. I don't know if you were really thinking about them and super deliberate about what you were saying, but it felt like both of you were just these vessels of great information and helping people understand it. And I feel compelled to say, as you start this journey for yourself, you should expect some setbacks. You should expect that you are going to change your life and that the other people around you do not want to come on that ride. And therefore, these folks may have to exit the book for a couple of chapters. They may have to exit the book permanently, but if you want to change your life, you have to change your life. So as you're going through this journey, be patient with yourself. Be patient with the people around you who don't understand or can't understand what you're going through, and understand that this is your journey. It's not their journey. And really, that's the piece that I think so many people have to lock onto really fiercely, is like, okay, man, like my wife doesn't get this, or my husband doesn't get this, or my kids, they don't get this, or my family, they think I'm crazy. Let them. Like Mel Robbins says now, let them think you're freaking nuts, dude. Don't worry about it. Just work on yourself. And I think, Dave, you might have some opinion about this, but I think as you start to change your life and you start to put things back on the tracks and you start to show up differently for yourself, for the people around you,
Right.
for your community, people want a piece of that.
Well, in the initial phases, especially if you're in, maybe somewhat of a dysfunctional relationship with somebody, there can be some strong pushback to that, and I think, and I've seen this often with people that are early in recovery. They think, oh, well, now I'm finally getting sober. My wife should be thrilled, and then they're surprised that they're getting pushback. And the reason for the pushback is people develop their roles and their identity around what they do, even in dysfunctional relationships. So for some people, they're the rescuer. Well, now all of a sudden, if the person they're rescuing doesn't need them to be rescued anymore, they're out of a job. And that can really create a lot of strong pushback and subtle undermining and sabotage and things like that. So I think going into it with the idea of, I'm going to, get myself on a better track. And, I need to stay focused on that and not worry so much about whether people approve of it or not approve of it, and maybe come up with some strategies of being gentle to the people that are important to you, but that maybe are not fully supportive. And maybe you need to take people in measured amounts. You don't need to give them full access to your life, and maybe they need to be minimized a little bit for a period of time until you're strong enough to be able to deal with them without taking their negativity to heart.
It's well said. I'm going to grab it because I think it's something that we all need to hear right now. But, you know, I keep this in my office because it's a reminder that we are all the elephant tied to the plastic chair. And you have more strength than you can possibly imagine. And you have the ability to get up right now and start walking and start moving and start changing your life. You need not wait for anybody else. You don't need anybody's permission other than yours. But you are the elephant tied to the plastic chair. And so if you feel like getting up and making a difference in your life and the people around you, go. If the medicine is the way through it, take it. If therapy is the way through it, take it. If moving out of your house and changing your environment is what you need to do, take it.
Change anything.
Change anything.
Change
That's
anything.
It.
Just start making some movement.
I love it. Kharma, thank you so much for this great conversation today. We really appreciate you stopping by. We're going to link to you in our show notes so that anybody who feels like they would like to work with you and experience what you kind of bring to the party, they can. And Dr. Dave, thank you too, man. I really, you just were exceptional. You're always good, but today I felt like it was an A game. So thank you for being on this podcast as well.
Always a pleasure.
All right, Kharma.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So good. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Learn from People Who Lived It. We always say, as you're listening to these episodes, you probably feel like there's somebody you know who needs to hear the message. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to end this podcast. And the moment it's over, I don't want you to hesitate. I want you to copy the link right there. You can hit that little up arrow button, copy the link, send it to them right now in a text message, and just say, I heard this podcast today and I can't stop thinking about you. And they're going to get this. And hopefully they're going to get through all 55 minutes of this podcast and their life will forever be changed because of this conversation. So thanks again for following along, for listening, and we will see everybody next week on Learn from People Who Lived It. Take care.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1. To help you feel less alone. 2. Encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3. When you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.